what is the difference between F1 and F2, and how the two tiers of cars race? Well, let's break it down. Formula 1 is well and truly the apex of car racing, with 20 drivers vying for the championship title. But there is also Formula 2, where the future stars of F1 are nurtured and nourish themselves before they race for the big leagues. Kindergarten for the F1, if you will. Okay, that sounds pretty patronizing. And it is. Let's move on. All the renowned racers in recent years had previously raced in the F2 before making it big in F1. For instance, Charles Leclerc, Pierre Gasly, Lance Stroll, Alex Albon, and of course, the legendary and recent winning Max Verstappen were racing in F2 just a mere few years ago. Not so kindergarten-y anymore, is it, Mr. Scriptwriter? Yeah, keeping an eye on you. In fact, the truth of it is F2 is a surprisingly crucial stage before one makes his career in F1. But there aren't many differences, and both areas function along similar lines. But since it's a stage for the development of drivers, there are some granular exceptions to the rule that we'll quickly break down into 4 main sections. So here we go. First up, it's the cars. Unlike F1, every driver sits on the car designed by Dallara. Cars are completely identical to each other, while these drivers are backed by the same race engineers to ensure that the talent is recognized instead of the victory of the car specs. All teams in F1 design their own chassis and aerodynamics, but as mentioned above about F2 cars, all the designs and specs are exactly the same. So everyone gets equal resource distribution in every car. So this level playing field atmosphere is clearly a more established thing in F2. And I personally think the F2 is absolutely epic for this. Formula 2 also uses the newly inducted engine in the 2018 V6 engine, but the horsepower and turbo power is a little bit lower, which brings a difference in speed, which we'll explain in the next section. The speed. Since both F1 and F2 use the same engine, you'd think surely speed difference is marginal at best, and you'd be largely correct. After the newly inducted rules, F2 cars have really closed the gap to F1 cars in terms of speed. Tiny differences in speed mainly come from aerodynamic and chassis changes that are allowed in F1, with a lot of them bringing diminishing returns in terms of true changes in speed. In 2017, the gap between an F1 car and an F2 car was more than 10 seconds in Barcelona, which has reduced with both adopting V6 engines in 2018. But the real difference comes when F1 cars are allowed to custom spec their own cars to kingdom flipping come. Whether it's chassis, aerodynamics, or engine upgrades, they have historically been allowed to fill their boots in F1, really differentiating F2 in that respect. F2 cars peak at 10,000 RPM, whilst F1 cars hit up to 18,000 RPM. Giving F1 a minimum 20 to 30 km per hour advantage. The budget. We're talking moolah, we're talking dollar here, because money-wise, F2 teams comparatively have diddly flipping squats to that of their F1 counterparts. According to Forbes, F1 outfits spend an average of $250 million annually, whilst F2 team budgets come to around 2.5% of that. That is fractional. Holy moly, that's barely over 6 million. Wait a sec, did I just call 6 million fractional? Okay, 6 million isn't fractional to a person, but when you're talking F1 cars, F2 cars, that's pretty small. Really, truth be told, in the grand scheme of such an investment-centric and expensive sport, that really is moving into scraping the bottom of the barrel territory. Typically, drivers even pay a certain amount to race in F2, while this is frankly irregular in F1, with drivers like Lance Stroll and Nicholas Latifi being accused of being pay drivers. The teams. Like F1 teams, F2 teams have owners, but the capital expenditure is so much less, extending to the crew and staff that are hugely decreased in numbers, unlike the seriously hefty F1 teams. The two factors of capital and crew numbers pretty much go hand in hand. This year there are 11 teams in F2, meanwhile only 10 in Formula 1. Usually the academies of F1 teams are instrumental in setting up an F2 side while placing their own driver from the academy. Guys, we're not beating around the bush here on the Motiph. Being honest, the key takeaway is really the identical nature of the cars. It's what makes the F2 so exciting and so tantalizing to watch. So do yourself a favor, you're not doing this for me, get out there, if you're not watching F2 yet, give it a try, thank me in the comments. And we will see you in the next one.